welcome you to this session on Reality Check, What Fosters Innovation on Campus. I'm going to let our distinguished panelists introduce themselves. Their distinguished, if not overwhelming, resumes are available on your screens. Don't share them with your mothers because they'll wonder why you have not done as much as they have in their respective lives. John, if you'll begin.
I'm John Rum. I'm the Deputy CIO at Arizona State University, which means I'm the Barney Fife of ASU. But I spend most of my time working with analytics and data.
I'm Allison Salisbury. I'm president at Entangled Studios. We are an education venture studio based in San Francisco. We build, invest, and advise in education companies.
I'm Gregg, Scoresby, the founder and CEO of CampusLogic. No one's ever said I'm distinguished and overwhelming, so that was
You got a kudo.
That was really nice.
You got a kudo.
It happened today.
You can reference that on your LinkedIn page.
Let's tweet that out.
Yeah, we're a financial aid SaaS company that makes every student interaction mobile, simple, and personalized.
Good afternoon, I'm James Willey. I'm Senior Vice President of Product Management at Ellucian, and I get to wake up every day building new technology supporting the Empowered Campus.
I'm Ray Henderson. I'm currently the principal at my own boutique advisory in EdTech, and I've got 25 years of operating history, and mostly in the learning management system and a bit of a variety of EdTech startups.
So panel members, I'm going to ask if you could speak up a little bit. Even with the microphones, the acoustics in this room are not great. So use your kind of halfway outdoor voice, if you would, please. I've introduced the panel members. I would like to poll the audience very quickly to find out who you are and who we are likely to offend, not individually potentially, but in aggregate groups. How many of you are faculty, administrators, work on a college campus in one capacity or another? Thank you. How many of you are with technology, product, service, something providers? Okay. I understand that there are a few people here who are investors, maybe not in the room, but at the conference, who help these firms get funding and start up. Any investors in the room? Any philanthropists in the room? I know we have one media person in the room. In the context of things elsewhere, we will not ask that person, we will not isolate that person or ask that person to identify him or herself. We welcome the media to this event, unlike other kinds of gatherings. Anybody that I missed? All right, so a little bit of housekeeping before we begin. One, I have been instructed by the ASU GSV authorities that we will not take questions for this, so we're going to let the panel run with the time. That may disappoint some of you, that may, but those are the instructions I'm obligated to begin with. And I want to frame a little bit of our conversation, so let's stipulate a couple things about higher education, particularly since so many of you work in higher education. First, innovation is not an oxymoron, as much as it might seem to be at times when we talk about high colleges and universities. Second, it is not the case that you measure the pace of innovation in all contexts in higher education by the time it took to get the overhead projector out of the bowling alley and into the classroom. Anybody been bowling lately or in the last 20 years? As you may know, it's all computerized and idiot-proof. You don't have to worry about the math of strikes and spares. Third, let's acknowledge for the purpose of the conversation about innovation that higher education is a risk-aversive marketplace, that perfect is the enemy of the good sometimes. We like to get the best information we possibly can, that the decentralized committee structure that's also often involved in departmental or institutional committees is a real drag at times on innovation, about moving fast, moving quick. Let's also acknowledge that too often the conversation about change on the academic side for instruction or even the administrative side is done in the absence of a compelling reason to change. It's done as dicta as opposed to, this has real benefits. We see a lot of this in the conversation about instructional technology. A lot of this is done by epiphany and opinion in the absence of evidence, particularly for faculty members who need a compelling reason to change and a path to show me how I change. Is that okay? Are we all good with that? Okay. Yeah. And finally, I think the reference point for part of this conversation, we turn to Peter Drucker, who himself was an academic, New York University, later the Claremont Graduate University, and his comment that culture eats strategy or change for breakfast, because that too seems to be part of the landscape. So I want to begin with the conversation about culture, and what is it about the culture of colleges and universities that either fosters, impedes, or just kind of lies there in terms of the conversation. Ray, you have almost as much gray hair as I do, so I'm going to...
What hair I have.
So I have a hyperactive inference engine. John has gray hair. John, you are our sole academic representative. Upon you resides the honor and the reputation of 4,400 post-secondary degree granting institutions, 20 million students, 1.2 million administrators, tens of
I'm not
thousands.
feeling any pressure.
No, none at all. So let me begin with the bookends on this. John, the culture of higher education in terms of what that means about innovation and change.
Yeah. I mean, I think that ASU is a little bit different than your
And
typical.
admittedly, we'll stipulate that ASU is an outlier,
Okay.
given every sign here says you are the most entrepreneurial institution in the world.
Only 3 years in a row. Did I mention that?
No, not you. Okay. So, nonetheless, but what do you hear from others then?
Yeah, I mean, so it's hard because, living in a, innovation is part of our DNA at ASU, and we live innovation. But I think looking at other institutions, I think that when you think about innovation, failure can be an option.
Yeah.
And I think that's really the part, like, you're not always going to get everything right all the time. And so I think if other institutions, want to go down that innovation path, they have to realize that failure is an option, and there are opportunities out there.
But we don't do failure well. Ray, you've been involved with firms that have brought products and services.
Yeah.
Sometimes that works, sometimes it doesn't work as well as it might.
Yeah.
Campuses don't like failure. They have a very low tolerance for failure.
Yeah. So although I will say I have been, and I'd say I've been involved
I'm not saying all your efforts have been, but
but several I have assisted
you've
in
been on both sides.
several times in commercializing technologies that
Yeah.
started on campus and taking them to either products or companies. And I'd actually say, it's not questioning the thesis, but I just start with a comment on the culture. You asked culture of higher ed. I know this is the type of conference where sometimes we would be critical of sales cycles and obstacles and things in our way as, ed tech entrepreneurs. But I just have to say, I think the base case for innovation in higher ed, I'd say it's one of the things I'm proudest of about, what's happening here. I spend a lot of time with entrepreneurs on campus everywhere, and there's a lot of innovation that goes on. And the native, your base case of, you've got fundamentally incredibly smart people who are, the tolerance. We sometimes complain about any restrictions on our freedom and creativity, but there's a lot of freedom and creativity on campuses, and people have ideas and they want to try something new. The barriers to them trying something new don't seem to be very high. I don't find it. When I hear about bureaucracy on campus that slows down innovation, I'm like, what planet are we talking about when I compare it to trying to get, people say business moves so much faster. Business has far harder barriers a lot of times.
But business has a command and control culture that makes it much easier than the decision cycle. John, James, let me turn to you. So Ellucian is what I would characterize as a big technology platform company. You do large ERP systems.
Correct.
You have a large presence in the marketplace in terms of those ERP platforms. You're kind of navigating between where you'd like things you can offer, things you can bring, things you can lead. Sometimes your campus clients or some part of your campus clients, we want that, and others hold back. I think the cloud is a good example in terms of what I hear from technology leadership. We know it looms large, but we're not quite ready to go there yet, or the cloud technology providers in general haven't made the compelling statement. What's your sense of the culture issues in that environment?
Well, I sort of look at the campus as a highly federated model. Lots of buildings, lots of disparate processes, and in the end, usually that's lots of applications, not necessarily solutions. So looking at it from that lens, I agree with you that talking with someone individually about a need, there's no shortage of passion and drive and ambition to make something better for a student. It's really stepping back and looking at everything together, and then how do we, as technologists, sort of pull apart the complexities between those departments to make it easier.
Okay. And Gregg, to you and Allison, as in one sense kind of nominally sort of the entrepreneurs or people trying to bring new opportunities, new resources to campus, you've run up against culture, I suspect, as both an asset and an impediment. Gregg, and then Allison?
Oh, okay, me first. So when I heard the word culture, so for me, culture is defined as purpose, mission, and values. When I think about culture in an organizational context, that's what it means. You'd be hard-pressed to find a more purpose-driven, mission-driven, values-driven group of people than in higher education. So if you're going to, you think about innovation, this is pretty fertile ground for innovation when you've got a group of people that are super purpose-driven. So your example of the cloud, and is there resistance to the cloud? We've got 450 customers that have adopted financial aid processes in the cloud. So this is happening right now, and there's not resistance to it in my experience. In fact, I think schools are looking to this to drive real change, to make things easier for their students, to help their students get more access to financial aid, more access to education.
My reference to the cloud had more to do with the core, largest part of the ERP applications, and we've seen some slowness about that. The take-up hasn't been as fast. So Allison, if Gregg is right, and this is a culture that embraces innovation, why is it that higher ed has a bad rap among technology providers that there's not interest in innovation?
So, well, I think that fundamentally higher education is not great at partnerships generally. It's as if you're an ed tech company, it is almost impossible to find the right people to talk to. You might be passed around to 8 people before you learn you're actually not a fit at all. So it actually is a pretty painful interface that needs to be fixed, and there's some organizations that have actually made, Southern New Hampshire, has published, if you want to work with us, here are the steps you go through, here's what we expect along the way. It's made a really clear and transparent kind of interoperable process. But the question of the bigger question around innovation and barriers to innovation is, I think you hit it on it in your introduction, which is I think innovation efforts have been overhyped and completely untethered to a North Star. And so often innovation efforts happen very much on the margin, and faculty and staff whose day job is to educate learners get really disillusioned that it's worth anything. And so one of the biggest shifts that I've seen that is incredibly exciting, and I've seen it mostly in the last 6 months, is a recentering of the innovation agenda around big structural conversations, which centers around economic mobility. And that gets to the heart of, I think, sort of the mission and purpose of post-secondary education in this country. It mandates 2 structural changes. One is better serving people from the bottom 40%, and 2 is serving them in a way that actually allows them to be economically mobile. All of a sudden, you have massive questions that you have to deal with around sort of where they learn, how they learn. You have to embrace digital learning as a result. You have to fix your cost structure as a result. And then if there's sort of North Star motivating that work, I actually see people opening up to change and innovation. But I think innovation efforts to date, especially technology-centric ones, have been fairly untethered from a North Star. And so, of course, it's hard to sort of galvanize urgency and response.
Okay. So let's turn to the issue of leadership. I want to come back to a compelling reason to innovate, but I also want to talk about the role of leaders in that process. John, I think you made a very soft reference a few moments ago to ASU being ranked reasonably high about entrepreneurship on these kinds of issues. Michael Crow has had a great run here. John Hitt, I believe is the correct pronunciation, Central Florida, 25-year run in terms of transforming the institution. He's been president, I believe, for half of the 50 years of that institution. John is retiring. His successor has been named. It's hard to follow a hero. It's hard to follow a definitive leader. What is the role of leadership, and how do you sustain that beyond the person in a department, in a unit, or across at the campus level in terms of leadership and innovation? To you, John, first.
So I think part of it is, how do you find the creatives on campus, first of all? How do you put them together? And then second of all, how do you, like if you look at ASU, the design aspirations of the university, one of them is being entrepreneurial. So that's kind of part of that. And so we have permission now, especially at, I know, our campus and other campuses, they have the permission to spend the 5 or 10% a week. How do I sort of advance the institution in ways of new technologies or new processes?
I want to do a reality check. For those of you who work on campus, how many of you have that permission to innovate? And how many of you exercise it? And how many of you get support for it? That's why you're at this conference and your colleagues are not.
That's actually true. That's why they're here.
So that's really encouraging. So the question is, what happens when you go back to your campuses on Monday and you try to actually do that?
Financial is different from support.
I understand. I'm just throwing some stuff out there. Yeah. So let's talk more about leadership. All of you have dealt with different kinds of campus leaders, just very quickly down the line. We'll start with Allison to Gregg, to James, to Ray. 30 seconds about the role of leaders.
So I worked for the president of Davidson College a few years ago, sort of special projects and innovation, and saw sort of firsthand the role that sort of vision setting plays in this work. Similar to my sort of original comment, I think innovation has to be tethered to a North Star that galvanizes urgency and action. And first and foremost, I think it's the leader's role to do that, but then to get out of the way. And so I think there's kind of two other sort of groups of people a leader needs to figure out how to put in place. The first is sort of a role that I consider to be a champion, usually someone who has a tremendous amount of social and political capital, who can build consensus, who knows how to bring the right stakeholders along, but then also is sort of a portfolio of people who I'd consider sort of your internal founders. That can be faculty, it could be students, it can be staff. It's probably a whole portfolio of people who have it sort of in their blood to sort of try things that are scary and sort of have the capacity to sort of try 3 or 4 things and see to find the one that works.
Great.
And that I think the leader, the champion, the founders actually have to have a really sort of aligned dynamic for this to work.
Greg, the leadership issue?
Well, I wish I would have said what Allison said. That sounded really good.
All right, that's fine. You can just say ditto and we can move on.
But one extension I would say, I think good leaders, especially when it comes to innovation, are good at asking questions. Right? So what would happen if we could do X? What would happen? And so usually innovation starts with questions. So I think leaders need to be pushing their organization with questions that are searching for real solutions and real answers.
James, you deal with large systems. Some campuses are bringing new systems in or they're upgrading. So I want to focus that leadership question a little more specifically for you. You start with a project team at a client campus. There's somebody who is the designated leader or a key person or 2 or 3. A year and a half, 2 years in, often that key leader goes. How do they sustain that? What do you do when you're working with those campuses where there is that turnover in leadership, when people move on or go elsewhere?
Well, ultimately, it's really about taking a step back in the very onset of any project or initiative to make sure that you know what your end state's going to be, and more importantly, what your desired outcomes are, so that you can build the plan. And ultimately, it's
So you're talking about the North Star that Allison alluded to.
Yeah, same thing, but it's really about, it sort of goes back to the leadership thing. It's really about building teams. Teams can sort of support you when things change and when people change. And ultimately, it comes down to people that have that drive and passion in higher ed. And that's the other thing that's unique about this room, is having that ability. So that's the way I say we tend to insulate if that does happen, because it does happen. People do change, they retire, they move on, like you just said. So we have to find the best and the brightest to keep everything moving forward.
Ray, leadership turnover is not just on the campus side, but often on the provider side. And what I often hear from campus personnel is we have too much turn in the people that we work with from Acme Widgets. It takes us 6 or 8 months to build a relationship of trust and understanding, share decoder rings and vocabulary, and boom, that person is gone. So it's not just on our side. So I'll throw that one to you.
Yeah. So a couple of quick perspectives on that one. First of all, there's what you say. I think this varies a lot. This quality, depending on what the role is. It's actually, I think it's an interesting market opportunity for ed tech entrepreneurs to just reflect on the impact that it does have on campus as they think about creating product. So that's not quite on the theme here, but I did want to speak on the leadership question. I actually want to. There's a person who, I have an anecdote about a leader that I will share.
And you have 30 seconds for it.
30 seconds. Okay. So Javier Mieres, University of UMUC, University of Maryland University campus, a very innovative school in its bones, a school that challenged itself to say, let's create all of our content as OER to reduce the cost of instruction. They are also one that very focused on the adult learner and alternative credentials, or not alternative credentials, alternative learners. I think they lead the league in military, online military instruction. During the economic downturn of the 7-8 time period, 2007-8, there was also something called sequestration, and the government began to shut down. This was a huge portion of their populace, and so Javier talks about the perfect storm that descended on UMUC. There was an existential question for them. Their P&L was turned upside down. 7 years after that happened, the methods that they used to save themselves, to measure their product line P&L, to understand the scope of all the decisions that they needed to make the best ones for the institution. They had encapsulated that into an analytics product, and they decided, and they had made so much additional income from using it that they could fund the offshoot of the company. And they invested $10 million in the company that produced the analytics dashboard they used to manage themselves through a crisis. I think that's some innovative leadership, an example of just sort of turning something that was a very tough set of circumstances into an opportunity. So
I want to talk about the movement of cup to lip, which sounds very strange. First day of a graduate course in public policy, professor comes in, slams down a bunch of textbooks, this was decades ago, and says if you want to understand public policy, it's the movement of cup to lip. Several of you on this panel and throughout this conference, there's been a conversation about a huge public policy issue, and that is equity. That is what's going on in terms of the gap between the rich and the not so rich. The fact that college retention rates have been stagnant and have been falling, particularly for in some cases, for first-gen, Pell Grant, and students of color. That's a policy issue. So it's a matter of reach, and how do we do that? Finding the tools that may or may not be innovative, because so much, again, has been on the basis of epiphany. If you look at the Higher Education Act, for example, in 1965, Lyndon Johnson's signing statement was, let all who are able, and we thought the enabling part of that was money. And we have learned 58 years later, it's not just money, it's other parts of the infrastructure. So that's a jump ball question. I said I wouldn't do this, but I'll give that as a jump ball. Who wants to take that first? Allison, thank you.
I'm not going to take it directly, but there's two things I think a lot about, and this is ultimately the framing for me around anything innovation in post-secondary education. The first is the sort of research that's been done by Lumina and Gates and others around the 11 million sort of post-secondary credentials that we are going to have a shortfall around by, I think it's 2025. I think if you were to have every single post-secondary institution in this country increase the number of students they serve 5% compound annually, we would barely get there. So it's just like a pure capacity play. Like our system is not designed to sort of to have that kind of scale. And I think that, coupled with the pretty sobering data that's come out of Equality of Opportunity Project, sort of researchers, Raj Chetty, and access to IRS data to be able to link where you went to school with what your earnings are by the time you're in your mid-30s, have shown that first and foremost, the post-secondary sector is pretty bad at serving anybody in the bottom 40%, especially at the elite end, where they serve more in the top 1% than the bottom 60 combined. And second, where they do serve them, often they don't do it very well. And so those two things combined to me say, yes, it's a policy problem, but it's also it's a problem with sort of the way we've designed our system.
The question is, how do you connect the dots to affect policy? That's what I want, because that really requires innovation. The old quip that's attributed to Einstein but is not, according to the Einstein Institute, insanity is doing the same thing over and over again and expecting a different outcome. And there's no, higher education does this all the time. In a lot of our practices and a lot of our policy, in gateway courses, we don't fix the course. We tell students who have had a problem with STEM courses in math and algebra, go back and take it again, as if the second going is going to repair the problem as opposed to the problem in the course. Anybody? John, you want to take a shot at that? No. Audience, anybody? Real quickly? All right, well, let's move on. I want to talk about infrastructure and the relationship between innovation and infrastructure. Often we talk about innovation without considering the importance of infrastructure to make that possible. John, you're part of the infrastructure at Arizona State.
Yeah.
Most innovative campus in the country? Okay. What is the alignment in terms of what happens at innovation, large and small, at Arizona State, in terms of baking it in as opposed to bolting it on?
Well, I think it first starts, with the leadership again, that a large percentage of our budget, we realize for us to scale and to us to advance, we need to invest in technology. Mm-hmm. So clearly in the top, we have a large organization with a lot of funding. So I think that's part of it. And talking about infrastructure, it's like, how do you worry about core versus context? Context work, running email systems, let someone else do that. If I want to run our LMS systems or our ERP systems, let someone else do that. And so I think that's how do we then do that context work somewhere else and then focus the core on student success, student learning. And I think that's where we've tried to do is offload some of that context work to help us be more innovative. And talking a little bit about taking infrastructure as a little different definition, the opportunity now with the public cloud and the services that they provide and the ability to move fast, I think that is going to help everyone sort of level the playing field a little bit where everyone can be a lot more agile with these services that are being offered.
Gregg, comment on infrastructure?
Yeah, I think there's a couple forms of infrastructure. Certainly technology infrastructure is part of it. John was alluding to this a little bit, but I think the people infrastructure, people able to vet technology solutions. So Arizona State happens to be a customer of ours as well, and they had really great infrastructure around doing deep security review on our products that was both helpful to us and gave them comfort about our products as well. Not every school has that sort of infrastructure. Connecting, doing single sign-on to Arizona State University's, the rest of their infrastructure was relatively easy because they've got the people infrastructure to do it. And I think schools that invest in the people and processes around the core technology infrastructure to enable companies like ours to help really innovate around a particular process or problem are the beneficiaries of that. Often it's the infrastructure isn't just the technology, because a lot of that's in the cloud, but it's actually the people and the process around that.
James, while Ellucian is an ERP provider,
Correct.
you know, if you extend sort of the periphery of the boundaries of what you do, you're also in the analytics environment.
Correct.
Analytics are part of the new infrastructure today. If you look at the conversation, the Georgia State Award, in terms of effectively eliminating the gap, the public statement about that is they did it with incredible analytics. You sort of go 2 inches beneath that, they hired several hundred people to do soft support to make that work. The BAs for baristas at Arizona State is not just because ASU has got great stuff on screen, they have an incredible infrastructure and support service for those students. At other places as well, too often that other part of the infrastructure in the area of analytics, it's the training. What do we do with the data the day after? It's not just enough to kick out the automatic email and say, Casey, you're having a problem, help me out. How does Ellucian work with campuses to understand that part of the infrastructure and the link between analytics, advising, and services as infrastructure?
Yeah, so first, it's really taking a step back and understanding that the biggest component in the analytics world is the data itself.
Yeah.
And can the data itself become actionable on campus? And you know, we talked earlier about this federated world. So for us, it's really taking a step back and recognizing that it is very complex, and our goal is to bring all the data together, rationalize it, and so then you can deliver the insights. And you want to know, you know, first generation students, where are we at? And the most important part is getting people, a community of people, to actually help build those analytic outcomes so they know what to, whether it's Gates that we work with or whoever we're working with, we're purpose building things for questions that people need to have answers. So starting to move away from the platform, even though I build platform, starting to really worry about individual answers to questions that people need. That's the most important driver. And building it for people who need it, meaning the people that do their daily jobs every day on campus, they need the answers. We need to move, you know, trying to move away from the tools construct or the big box is a key driver for what, you know, what we're doing.
But it is the case that the sum is more than the parts.
It is.
And I think, again, John, about Arizona State, in terms of what happens both with your on-campus and your online students, a lot of other places as well, it's aligning those infrastructure components in terms of student success, institutional effectiveness. Allison, you're shaking your head.
I'm agreeing.
Okay.
Yeah, I mean,
Would you like to go beyond that, then?
I think it's true for any technology
Yeah.
adoption. I mean, education's a complex social system. It's not something that's going to be solved with AI, like an AI rollout. And so
But if I may, I mean, a lot of the conversation is technology is going to save us. A lot of the conversation that I've heard for the folks who've gotten reputations for innovation in some of these sessions, the references to the technology, not the infrastructure and support that adds value to the technology.
It helps us.
Yeah.
It doesn't save us.
So
We're the only ones that can save us.
I'll connect a couple of points here and what I said earlier too. So let me just give you a real specific example. Do you think that there are differences in how low-income students are receiving scholarships, loans, and grants across institutions? Does anybody think there are differences? Absolutely, there are differences. So start with the question, why are low-income students at my school less likely to receive scholarships and grants and other non-lending assets here relative to my peer group? So you got to have the data, but you got to have the questions and the ability to answer the questions too. So technology is an enabler, but if you're not asking the questions and you're not driving toward, hey, let's take action and fix this problem to increase access and create more equity, you're never going to get there. So it's got to be a combination of investing in technology and also being really driven to ask hard questions, and push to get answers to those questions.
Ray?
Yeah, no, I think that's a lot of it just strikes me as being, right on. I'd also just note, you mentioned you were touching on the question of efficacy earlier. Maybe I'll just trace that, in here when you talk about the introduction of analytics. And I'm involved in some analytics spin-offs and been involved in some companies in that area, and we've got some good advice about that. But one of the things that I try to do in talking about approaching product in that context is trying to look at efficacy as something that you can prove out as opposed to having proof today, because the real questions around efficacy, I've been in a lot of rooms where the questions are asked, everyone knows they're going to be asked. It's a very expensive answer to answer honestly, and particularly in this context of innovation, like who's going to, quote, prove out something as effective prior to its basic introduction? Right? And it seems like we're always caught up, we've got a sort of cat and mouse around that question. And the idea of like, hey, analytics, the thing it can provide is its coverage for, will you take measurement, or some
Right.
into effect and design that into your approach going forward. So I think it's very, very useful to have, and along with a lot of different types of innovation.
But you have to have a morning after strategy for what you do with
Yeah,
it.
I think
And often there's a disconnect in many institutions.
It's also easier, I think, to get realistic about what could happen in the context of looking for effectiveness going forward, as opposed to satisfying the criteria, right? Because it's a hard satisfy for most of these things when you.
Why is it that analytics seems to fall short? I've done a bunch of national surveys of CIOs and provosts over the last several years, and when you ask them to rate institutional satisfaction for themselves and others, different parts of their EIP, ERP, and IT infrastructure, invariably analytics gets the lowest ratings. Why? James, to you. Are we just too early in the cycle?
No.
Okay.
It's actually usually analytics is at the end of the cycle. In my world, when you
Yeah.
implement a system, we tend to think that we need the data at the end.
Yeah.
So that we can begin. And then the other thing for me is analytics has always been treated as a tool-first approach for a lot of institutions. Like, I'm going to use this great tool that can do lots of things, and what I end up doing is spending all my time defining something instead of answering it. And so for me, it's really about changing what analytics is. It's much more of a content-driven approach. It's looking at individual metrics that we know we need, and then can we design the data structures to answer the questions.
All right, so design would suggest baking it in as opposed to bolting it on.
Yeah, if you think content first and make it in line with the other experiences, I think you can change the model.
I think there's a real problem in
Yep.
analytics. So I've worked over my career with probably 1,000 different financial aid offices. And almost every one of those schools has some business intelligence tool at the institution. And I've never once, not once, seen a financial aid office actually have access to these BI tools, right? There's not an absence of tools out there.
Actually,
Now,
let me pause. Let's poll the audience. How many of you have access to sort of end-user analytic tools that aid what you do?
It's not just access
And training.
Access without having to call the IT department to get an analyst to do something for you.
So again, how many of you have access to end-user, civilian-friendly tools
Civilian friendly.
that aid and inform what you do? All right, that's not enough. How's that? Okay, keep going.
And none of you are in the financial aid office that raised your hand, by the way.
I'm sorry?
And none of them that raised their hand are in the financial aid
Well,
office.
just in tools in general, not necessarily exclusively financial
I think
aid.
it depends on where you are in the institution as well, potentially. But I think the fact that you have to often call the IT department in your school and get an analyst to help you, do something or write something or build something can be hard. It's a limiter to accessing data. That's been my experience.
And I have a lot of experience in this, so.
Okay.
I think, first of all, just data is hard. Getting access to them, the systems aren't really built with data first in mind. Data is always a stepchild or as part of projects. And I think the second part is, getting the subject matter experts of these data to understand the nuances of it, and then enriching the data to the point where these tools can really consume it. I think those are some of the challenges of data.
John, isn't another part of the data challenge also that too often data has been used as a weapon and not as a resource? It's what you did wrong as opposed to looking at the data in and of itself, or
Yeah.
in terms on the benefit of good analytics to say, this is how you do better?
Yeah, and I think that some institutions might do that. I think if they have a mindset of, like, data is a university asset, then if they look at it from that vantage point versus a department who thinks they own the data and they use that as weapons or whatever that might be, I think that if you change that culture of treating data as a university asset, that no one really owns it, the university owns it. And I think that we err on the side of, we trust our employees. If you need the data to help do your job, we will give you that job. And we have policies that spirit of that is that data is free. We're not free, but it's available for you to do your job.
But I'm thinking, again, of a lot of campuses that make great proclamations of, by a particular year, we will do X. We will improve retention. We will improve graduation rates. We will do something about the DFW rate, I rate, in a STEM course or a gateway course or something else. And then the data get crunched and the data get projected. And, again, depending campus to campus, but from what I hear at a lot of campuses, maybe none of yours, maybe certainly not yours, John, it's that, we got thrown up against the wall and slammed because we said 4 and we only got 2, as opposed to saying, okay, how do we pull this together? James, I'm going to throw that one at you because you're sort of, a lot of data comes out of your systems.
Yes, it does. I mean, for us, it's really about driving. You just laid out the analytic.
Mm-hmm.
You just described the problem, the need, the answers that I want. So if you start with that, don't worry about the tools first. Let's figure out what the data models need to look like. Let's rationalize that, because we have, in some instances, you have the recruitment system, the admission system, all of these different systems talk in a different way, different language. And so bringing that all together so we can have one answer is the driver.
To the panel, we'll just go down very quickly, 30-second responses. What is it that advocates for innovation have to do better? I'm not going to ask what they don't do well, but what is it they have to do better? Greg, let me start with you. We'll start in the middle and then loop around.
So one of the responses from the audience earlier was financial resources, I think, was mentioned as a challenge. I think one thing we could all be better at is, and I think actually the corporate world is better at this, at doing real ROI analysis on technology. I think sometimes it's getting budget and being able to communicate how we get budget for something and why this matters. And Ray talked about this a little bit earlier, but I think going deep on return on investment analysis for something is something that is probably not a skill set that is as broad in higher education as it could be. And if you want more access to tools that enable innovation, being better at making an argument for these tools and showing and talking about the real return that's expected and then measuring that return over time, I think is a key thing needed.
All right, so will you allow me to do a little bit of semantic enhancement to that? Because ROI is an anathema to many people who work on campuses. They don't want to talk about ROI if they live in an academic environment. But if you said the benefit of investment, a compelling reason about why we do this, that little bit of semantic tweaking may open up a lot more receptivity to the conversation. Is that acceptable?
Well,
I'm not excluding the ROI, but
I'm totally fine. You can use whatever words you want, Casey.
That's right. I'm the moderator.
Yeah,
Okay.
but I've not seen resistance to the words return on investment. I don't think return is just financial return.
Right. There's a value.
Yeah,
there's an outcome.
So yes, if to the extent that the words return on investment are problematic for people communicating, hey, we're going to enroll more students, we're going to retain more students, we're going to drive better outcomes here, then yeah, maybe there are better words. But I've not seen resistance to those words.
But I think that's one of the culture issues. James?
Yeah, I would say for me, being in technology is what we could do is listen a lot more. Seek to understand exactly what the needs are versus focusing on what I call a platform view, where I'm going to bring in a tool across the entire eco and fix everything. Find someone that has a very defined user need, a problem, and then step back and figure out what tools you need to bring to bear to make it happen. So for us, it's really about taking time to listen.
Okay. Ray, what do the advocates need to do better?
Yeah, so I'd say I think it's the hard balancing act that I see as I think about people who've innovated on campus, and I'm thinking more about people who built companies in the end. But it's the twin issues of both setting a vision that's a compelling long-range vision and setting expectations that are realistic in the time period that people are looking at. I think that's one of the things that often, it's easy to blur those two and to set expectations that can't be met, in a time period that, innovation, people can be patient, but there's a limit on that patience, and getting those, balances right, I think is super important.
John?
I mean, following on the listening, you need to talk to your customers. You need to survey them early on in the game to find out, is this really working? So you don't spend a lot of time, just building noise out there.
And for the record, you have customers at ASU much like you are a customer for the technology providers.
Yeah.
Okay.
That's true. And I think the other thing is that knowing that technology happens on the edge, so it's just not the central IT organization who's building the better processes, who's building the innovation. It's happening at the edges, and having the ability to be open to those as those ideas funnel to like a central IT, where we can help scale these innovations to a level to
Allison,
students.
what do the advocates need to do better?
A lot of things. I'm debating which direction to go.
Top three.
Yeah. On one hand, I actually think one of the important insights for me is actually innovation efforts have to measure the right thing. And oftentimes, I think we pick proxies that aren't actually the thing we care about. And so, very tactically, there's been some research done on sort of rollouts of adaptive learning within developmental education. And when you look at the data around sort of how students performed that had it versus not, it's actually really similar in terms of their achievement. But then I think it might have been Montgomery Community College. You actually study how they do in subsequent courses, and the ones that had the adaptive learning technology do quite better, because even though maybe they did equally as well in that one course, it meant they learned the material in a lot deeper way, they retained it better, and they translated it into further coursework. If they had stopped the study after that first course, they never would have known that. And so it's actually asking, like, what are the right proxies for the things that you care about? I think even the metric of completion is a problematic metric because there's three ways you might increase your completion numbers. The first is you make it harder to get in. Right. The second is you make it easier to graduate. And the third is you actually improve. And so when we say completion, like what is it we're actually measuring? And is that like the right proxy for the thing that we care about?
Okay. Which is easier, operational innovation or instructional innovation? If you look at the landscape of higher education, there's the operational side of the house that begins with those first emails or kids hitting screens saying, and adults, I want to know something about Acme College or Acme Community College, on through the admissions, the financial aid process, all the stuff that's operational. And there's the instructional side, that is faculty departments' content. In terms of doing innovation, is it easier to do instructional or is it easier to do operational? Panel, very quickly. Instructional or operational? John?
Operational.
Allison?
Operational.
Greg?
Well, I would say operational, but that's also, I'm entirely operational. Right?
Okay.
I've got no context otherwise.
You've probably heard some things about the other.
Yeah, same.
Yes.
Why?
Absolutely operational.
So you are in consensus about operational is
So I'd
easier?
say, operational, so much of the operational innovation can happen around something where you can watch a workflow, and you can look at the workflow, how work gets done, how it's designed, and you can play with that, maybe re-segment it or accelerate certain parts of it the machine can do a little bit better. The educational delivery, there are all these wait states that are, and then perception of where the learner is and what's needed next happens, which is just sort of
Easier to reach consensus on the outcome, more command and control? Is that part of it as well?
Well, operational is incremental improvement. It's saying, how do we do what we're doing incrementally better, more efficiently, with better outcomes? Structural, I think, actually has to ask questions about, is the thing we're doing even the thing we want to do more of, or do we need to do something fundamentally different? I mean, that structural innovation is what I think actually higher education is not designed to do. And the ones that sort of make the list, what they're doing is actually saying, let's have the operational improvements, but that's actually create a space where we can take big bets on something completely different.
Okay. Panel, we've wandered the landscape for about the last 38 minutes on a lot of different things. Leadership, culture, more. What have we missed in the conversation about innovation? What do we need to come back to and say, attention really must be paid to this specific thing? James, let me go to you for that first.
Thank you.
You were lurking. You were hoping I wouldn't.
Yeah.
There's no back of the room here.
I think we've had pieces of it, but I think that innovation is really inside of everybody.
And I think that's the other thing, that we think we need always this luminary or someone that's going to come in and define the answer. I think
Wave the wand.
yeah, and
Bright
you know,
light.
or you're going to have a vendor that's going to walk in and say, "Here's this wonderful thing." The reality is, a solution takes much more than the code or the applications or the analytic. It's really about the people who built it and having all that come together. So I think the other thing that's unique is the world of higher ed is quite a bit more open, transparent, easier to collaborate, and I think that's something that I think we could leverage more to coalesce around these issues and needs.
What do we need to do better, Ray? What have we missed? What have we missed?
Again, I'm more focused on the company spin-off context
Okay.
and innovation, just from the role that I play. And I'd say, when you talk about infrastructure, for example, I like someone to mention the people infrastructure. It's not even necessarily the expense, it's that leadership question, it's the orientation to, in the absence of strict rules, what does one do in this circumstance? It's setting a bias about, do you want to have innovation around spinning off companies and helping truly launch entrepreneurs? If you do, there are some very clear questions that are super simple to answer. What's your orientation towards, sharing, the equity for this idea with the entrepreneur, and how do you work on that on your campus? One thing that's very interesting, there's very, very similar experience in talking to budding entrepreneurs that are coming off of campus when you speak about the ideas and their passion for the ideas and their approach for a problem. There's a lot of similarity in how people think about that. When you get to the question that inevitably, if you're going to launch something, tell us about your ownership of this idea, or what restriction or what relationship you have with your university. There's a very high degree of variability, across entrepreneurs. Extraordinary, and there's a lot of statements that are, well, I assume I own it, I ought to, and those are, of course, places where that in-rushes skepticism from capital. And it delays, conversations and preventing things like that. So,
John, what have we missed in this conversation?
I think it really goes back to the definition of what is innovation. There's so many different ways to innovate. So it's more than just building a new tool. It might be a process that I improve, or maybe take an existing technology and find a new market out there. So I think that's what we're missing.
Allison, what have we missed that we really need to pay attention to? Where's been the void? What do you want us to understand?
I'm going to be a broken record on this one, but I really think it's recentering the conversation on North Star that galvanizes urgency. Because what we're missing, sort of in the post-secondary sector, is urgency to solve a real problem. And so I was with a group of chief innovation officers at universities a few weeks ago, and we were talking about what does it look like to recenter the innovation agenda on economic mobility. First and foremost, it's better serving people in the bottom 40%. And it was fascinating, because then the response was, but our cost structure doesn't allow us to do that. The amount of money we'd have to raise or find to support more people to attend this place, it's not sustainable. And then it was fascinating, because a woman in the room who's one of the most anti-innovation people ever, her response was, well, then maybe you need to change your price point. And then so all of a sudden, it's not a change because you're being disrupted, you're going to be displaced, you cost too much and you're not worth it. That's not motivating. All of a sudden is we have this mission as a public good that we're fundamentally not making good on, and we need big structural changes to sort of move forward.
Greg, what have we missed in this wide-ranging conversation?
Well, this is a little bit. I always want to go after Allison because she gives me good content here to think about. But I do think the concept of thinking about North Star. This is true for organizational alignment in general. This is not specific to higher ed, but top to bottom organizational alignment allows innovation to happen everywhere. So if you're working toward this North Star, there are big macro long-term goals of the institution, but there are departments within every institution that can make something better tomorrow and next week and next month. So, and I think there's a portfolio of innovative projects a school can take on, or some short-term and long-term, but if you have good organizational alignment top to bottom, everybody in the institution can make a difference in some way in the short and medium and long term.
Great. John, you look like you're ready to posture. You want to jump for a last comment?
No.
No? Last? You want to? No? All right. So I want to thank our panel. They're sending me very mixed signals as I'm trying to close. Because I get penalized if I hold you more than 30 seconds. There's a woman in a blue vest who's going to start pushing you all out. So, John Rome from Arizona State, Allison DULIN Salisbury from Entangled Studios, Gregg Scoresby from CampusLogic, James Willey from Ellucian, and Ray Henderson from the world, actually, from Lessons Learned Ventures. Thank you all. Thank you all for joining us.